Rebecca Brown had $20 to her name when she found him collapsed outside a Seattle convenience store at 2 in the morning. $20 her daughter's lunch money, bus fare, maybe dinner if she stretched it, 3 days until payday, 3 days of making impossible choices. But this rain-soaked stranger in the expensive suit was dying in front of her. So she made the choice that would destroy her life. She helped him. What Rebecca didn't know was that 17 people had already walked past Min Soo Kang that night, and he'd counted every single one. What she also didn't know was that her $20 act of kindness had just made her the most valuable person in a criminal empire she didn't even know existed. But 12 hours before that rain-soaked decision, Rebecca was just another invisible woman, the kind who'd spent 32 years making herself smaller, needing less, asking for nothing. This is her story, and it begins at the end of a double shift. Rebecca's apartment was 12 blocks away. Too far to walk in this rain with a man who could barely stand. Too expensive to call a cab when those $20 were supposed to stretch 3 more days. But she'd already made the decision, hadn't she? The moment she'd stopped walking, the moment she'd looked at him instead of through him, the choice had been made. She flagged down a taxi with her free hand, the stranger's weight heavy against her side. He smelled like expensive whiskey and rain, his breathing shallow but steady. The cab driver, an older Somali man with kind eyes, took one look at the situation and didn't ask questions. Some cities taught you when to see and when to look away. Capitol Hill, Rebecca said, giving her address. The $20 bill felt like lead in her palm as she handed it over at the end of the ride, watching her safety net disappear into the driver's weathered hands. The stranger barely stirred as she maneuvered him up 2 flights of stairs, her CNA training the only reason she managed it without dropping him. Muscle memory from years of helping elderly patients transfer from beds to wheelchairs kicked in proper body mechanics, calculated weight distribution, quiet efficiency born from doing difficult things alone. Her apartment door opened to darkness, and the faint scent of the lavender spray she used to mask the building's persistent mildew. Lily was asleep in the only bedroom. The door cracked just enough that Rebecca could hear her daughter's soft breathing. Safe. Still safe. She guided the stranger to the worn couch, easing him down with practiced care. In the dim light from the kitchen, she could see him more clearly now. His suit was expensive tailored, probably cost more than her monthly rent. His face was younger than she'd initially thought, maybe late 30s, with strong features softened by exhaustion. A faint scar ran along his left eyebrow. His knuckles were bruised, she noticed, as if he'd recently hit something, or someone. Rebecca stood there for a moment, watching the rise and fall of his chest, and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. She'd brought a complete stranger into her home, into the space where her daughter slept. The smart thing, the safe thing would have been to keep walking, to let him be someone else's problem. But Rebecca had been someone else's problem her entire life. The daughter her parents couldn't quite afford. The wife her husband couldn't quite love. The employee hospitals worked to the bone but never quite valued enough to promote. She knew what it felt like to need help and have the world walk past, counting their own concerns as more important than your existence. She moved through the apartment quietly, checking on Lily first, still sleeping, her small hand curled around the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 2. Then to the bathroom for the first aid kit, back to the kitchen for water and aspirin, her movements automatic, purposeful. The stranger's pupils responded normally to the flashlight from her phone. No signs of concussion, just intoxication and exhaustion. She cleaned the small cut above his temple, not deep, wouldn't need stitches, and bandaged it with careful hands. He didn't wake, just settled deeper into the couch with a sound that might have been relief. Rebecca sat in the mismatched armchair across from him, her floral gown still damp from the rain, and watched this man who'd somehow become her responsibility. Outside, Seattle's rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows. Inside, the apartment was silent except for 2 people breathing, one in exhausted sleep, one in quiet vigilance. She thought about the $20, about Lily's lunch tomorrow, about the ramen in the cupboard, and whether she could make it stretch another way. About whether her coworker Janet might lend her $10 until Friday, or if asking would finally confirm what Rebecca already knew, that everyone saw her struggling and had collectively decided it wasn't their concern. The stranger shifted, his hand falling to the side, and something slipped from his jacket pocket. A business card, simple and elegant. No company name. Just a name, Min Soo Kang, and a phone number in clean, understated font. Rebecca picked it up, turned it over in her hands. She didn't know that name, didn't recognize it from anywhere. But somehow, holding that card, she felt the first whisper of understanding that this night had set something in motion she couldn't take back. What Rebecca couldn't know, sitting in her worn armchair at 3 a.m., was that Min-Soo Kang had been counting 17 people. 17 opportunities for someone to prove that humanity still existed outside transactions and obligations. 17 failures before her. And now, in her small apartment that smelled like lavender and old building, with her daughter asleep 10 feet away and her last $20 gone, Rebecca Brown had just become the answer to a question Min-Soo had stopped believing had an answer. By morning, nothing would ever be the same. Morning light filtered through Rebecca's thin curtains, turning the small living room golden and exposing what the darkness had hidden. A scene that should have terrified her. A strange man on her couch. Her 7-year-old daughter awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor just 3 feet away from him, drawing in her notebook with purple crayon. Rebecca froze in the doorway, still wearing her scrubs from the night shift she'd somehow made it to after 2 hours of restless sleep. Her heart hammered against her ribs, every maternal instinct screaming danger. But Lily looked up at her with that frank, fearless curiosity only children possess. "Mom, is he okay?" Lily whispered, gesturing at the stranger with her crayon. "You said he fell down, that he needed help." "That's right, baby." Rebecca moved closer, placing herself between her daughter and the couch, her body a shield even as her voice stayed calm. "We helped. That's what we do." Lily nodded, satisfied with this explanation, and returned to her drawing a purple house with a crooked door and flowers that looked like stars. The stranger stirred. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the light, and for a moment he looked confused, disoriented. Then his gaze found Lily first, taking in the small girl with her notebook and crayons, then moved to Rebecca standing protectively nearby, and something shifted in his expression. Not alarm. Not quite recognition. Something softer, more fragile. "You're awake," Rebecca said quietly, holding out a glass of water and 2 aspirin. No fear in her voice, no expectation of gratitude or explanation. Just the same calm efficiency she used at work when patients woke confused in unfamiliar rooms. "How are you feeling?" Min-Soo sat up slowly, accepting the water with careful hands. His English, when he finally spoke, was precise, each word measured. "I should go. I've imposed enough." "You should eat first," Rebecca replied, already turning toward the kitchen. Not a question, not a demand. Just a statement of what should happen next. The same tone she'd used with Lily 100 times when the child was overtired and needed guidance. When the world felt overwhelming, and someone needed to decide what came next. She moved through the small kitchen with practiced efficiency, scrambled eggs from the 4 remaining in the carton, toast from the last of the bread, the final splash of orange juice poured into 3 glasses. Not enough for any of them to feel full, but enough that no one would go hungry. She set the table, gave Lily the fullest glass of juice, took the smallest portion of eggs for herself, offered Min-Soo what remained without hesitation. Min-Soo watched this choreography from the couch, unable to move, unable to speak. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "You can judge a person's heart by how they set a table. If they give you the best pieces and take the smallest for themselves, you know they have a good soul." Henjongshik, his grandmother had called it. The grace of ensuring everyone was fed at once. The honor in making sure no one's bowl sat empty while another's overflowed. He'd grown up watching her prepare meals for extended family, for neighbors who'd fallen on hard times, for anyone who entered her home hungry. She'd feed 12 people from enough food for 8, and somehow everyone would leave satisfied. He hadn't experienced that kind of care in 20 years. Not since she died. Not since the world taught him that everything, every meal, every gesture, every moment of kindness came with a price. "Come sit," Rebecca said, and Lily bounced to the table immediately, her small legs swinging beneath her chair. Min-Soo joined them, moving carefully, aware of his rumpled suit, his bruised knuckles, the way he must look in this modest space. He watched Rebecca help Lily cut her toast, watched her take the smallest bites of her own food, watched her glance at him to make sure he was eating. "I'm Min-Soo," he offered quietly, testing if his name meant anything to her, waiting for the flash of recognition, the shift in demeanor that always came when people realized who he was. "Rebecca," she replied, sipping her juice. "This is Lily." "Hi," Lily said through a mouthful of eggs. "Do you like dogs?" "I want a dog, but Mom says our apartment doesn't allow pets. Do you have any pets?" Minsu blinked, caught off guard by the child's directness. "No. No pets." "That's sad," Lily announced with the grave certainty of 7-year-olds. "Everyone should have something to take care of." The words hung in the kitchen like something prophetic. Minsu looked at this little girl with her crooked ponytail and her purple crayon drawings, and felt something crack in his chest, the same thing that had cracked last night when Rebecca stopped walking, when she chose to see him, instead of looking away. When breakfast was finished, Minsu reached for his wallet. His movements were deliberate, practiced the gesture of a man accustomed to resolving debts with money. "Please, let me pay you back. For the cab, for—" "No," Rebecca said simply, gathering plates. "You needed help. I helped. That's all. I must owe you something." "You don't owe me anything." She met his eyes then, and Minsu saw something there he couldn't name. Not pity, not pride. Just a quiet certainty that kindness didn't require repayment. Sometimes people just need help, and sometimes other people help them. That's how it's supposed to work. Minsu stood, straightening his wrinkled suit, feeling the weight of her words settle into places he'd thought were numb. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in ways he couldn't articulate. "For seeing me." Rebecca tilted her head slightly, puzzled by the phrasing but not questioning it. "You're welcome." At the door, Minsu paused. He pulled out a business card, simple, elegant, just his name and a number, and placed it on the counter by the door. "If you ever need anything, call." Then he was gone, disappearing down the stairwell, leaving Rebecca standing in her doorway with a daughter asking if the nice man would come back and a business card that raised more questions than it answered. What Minsu couldn't tell her, what he'd never told anyone, was that he'd just experienced something more valuable than any transaction he'd ever made. He'd been cared for without contract, fed without obligation, seen without fear. And somewhere between the scrambled eggs and the purple crayon drawings, Minsu Kang realized he'd found something he hadn't been looking for. Something worth protecting. 3 days later, the International District Market bustled with its usual Saturday morning chaos. Korean grandmothers argued over the price of dried anchovies in rapid haggle. The smell of fermenting kimchi drifted from open storefronts, mixing with the sweet scent of fresh-baked pastries from the Japanese bakery on the corner. And Rebecca Brown stood in front of a produce stall, completely lost, trying to remember if the thicker daikon radishes were better, or if that was just a myth. She'd been coming to this market for 6 months, ever since she'd discovered produce here cost half what the Safeway near her apartment charged. But she still felt like an outsider, navigating a world whose language she couldn't speak, whose customs she didn't understand. She picked up one radish, then another, feeling their weight, knowing she was guessing and hoping she guessed right. "The medium ones," a voice said behind her. "Thick ones are woody in the center." Rebecca turned, and there he was, Minsu, but transformed, no longer the rain-soaked stranger on her couch, but composed, put together. Dark jeans, a charcoal sweater that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget, hair styled back from his face. He looked like he belonged here, comfortable in a way she'd never felt in this market. "Oh," she said, startled. A small smile touched her lips, genuine, unguarded. "Thank you. I never know what I'm doing here." "You shop here often?" Minsu asked, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, taking in everything, the bags under her eyes, the worn jacket, the careful way she was calculating prices before touching anything. "When I can. It's cheaper than the grocery store near my apartment, and Lily likes the mochi from the Japanese bakery." She paused, suddenly self-conscious. "I never properly thanked you. For leaving so quietly that morning. For not making things awkward." "You fed me breakfast," Minsu said simply. "You treated me like a person, not a problem. There's nothing awkward about kindness." Something in his phrasing made Rebecca look at him more closely. The way he said, "treated me like a person," as if that was unusual, as if that was remarkable. Before she could respond, Minsu gestured to the produce surrounding them. "May I? I grew up coming to markets like this with my grandmother. I could help you navigate." Rebecca hesitated, pride warring with practicality. Then she nodded. I'd appreciate that. They fell into step together as Min-soo began translating the market. His voice was calm, informative, carrying none of the condescension she'd experienced from other shoppers who'd watched her fumble with unfamiliar ingredients. Those are kakakdugi, he said, pointing to containers of cubed radish kimchi. Less sour than the cabbage kind, better for children who aren't used to fermented foods. At the mushroom stall, he paused. Pyogo beoseot, shiitake mushrooms. The dried ones make better broth, richer flavor. But they're expensive. The fresh ones still give good depth if you cook them longer, 40 minutes instead of 20. Rebecca absorbed the information like someone who'd been trying to read a map in the dark, and suddenly been handed a flashlight. The market, which had always felt foreign and slightly intimidating, began to make sense. She could see patterns now, understand the logic behind the organization of stalls, the rhythm of how vendors interacted with customers. At the noodle display, Min-soo picked up a package of clear, slippery-looking noodles. Sweet potato noodles japchae. They taste a little sweet, almost nutty. Good with vegetables and a simple sesame oil dressing. Lily would like them. The fact that he remembered her daughter's name, that he was thinking about what a 7-year-old might enjoy, made something warm unfold in Rebecca's chest. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally, as they paused near the herb section, where bundles of perilla leaves and Korean chives hung in fragrant clusters. Min-soo considered the question, standing in a market that smelled like his grandmother's kitchen, that looked like the Busan mornings he'd tried so hard to forget. "You helped me first," he said quietly. "This is a very small repayment. You don't owe me anything." "I know." He met her eyes then, and Rebecca saw something there she couldn't quite name. "That's why I want to." They continued through the market, and something unexpected happened. The conversation found its natural rhythm. Min-soo asked about Lily, what she liked to eat, whether she was adjusting well to second grade. Rebecca asked about his work, and he said he ran an import business. Nothing more specific than that. The vagueness felt deliberate, but Rebecca didn't push. She'd grown up learning that some questions were better left unasked. What surprised her more was how easy his presence felt. No expectation, no pressure, just the relief of proximity to someone who saw her struggling, and chose to make it easier rather than looking away. For Min-soo, the experience was equally disorienting. He was being useful, genuinely useful, in a way that had nothing to do with leverage or obligation or positioning. He wasn't translating this market to gain advantage. He was doing it because Rebecca looked lost, and he had knowledge that could help, and helping her felt like the most natural thing in the world. When they reached the checkout, Rebecca's careful mental calculations visible in how she sorted her produce, Min-soo quietly handed the vendor his card before she could protest. "You don't have to," Rebecca started. "Repayment," Min-soo said firmly. "For the $20. For the cab fare. For the breakfast." But they both knew it wasn't about repayment. It was about the strange, fragile thing taking shape between them, the understanding that they were both navigating worlds that felt foreign, both trying to find footing in lives that had taught them to expect nothing. As they parted outside the market, Lily's mochi secured in a small bag, and Rebecca's groceries distributed between them, Min-soo hesitated. "I work in import and export," he said, the words careful, measured. "Goods from Korea, Japan, some from China. If you ever need anything at all, call me. The number I left you." Rebecca nodded, sensing the weight behind the offer, the deliberate vagueness of anything at all. "What exactly do you import?" she asked, the question gentle but direct. Min-soo's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Complicated things," he said finally. "I'm working on making them less complicated." Rebecca watched him walk away, disappearing into the market crowd, and felt the first whisper of understanding that Min-soo Kang was more than a businessman with expensive clothes and careful English. He was someone caught between worlds, just like her, someone trying to become something different than what he'd been. And for reasons she couldn't explain, that made her want to know him more, not less. The Madison Street bus stop at 1 p.m. offered no shelter from Seattle's October wind. Rebecca pulled her thin jacket tighter, the denim doing almost nothing against the cold cutting down the street. She calculated silently, could she afford a thicker coat before winter really hit? She'd need one by December at the latest. Maybe the thrift store on Broadway would have something. Maybe Janet at work would lend her $20. Probably not. The answer was usually, probably not. She'd just finished her shift at the dental office 3 nights a week, reception work that paid barely above minimum wage but came with the crucial advantage of ending at 10:30, which meant she could be home before midnight. Lily was at Rose's apartment 2 doors down, probably already asleep on Rose's couch, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Rose never asked for payment, but Rebecca always tried to leave something: groceries, help with Rose's own errands, whatever small currency she could trade for the gift of knowing her daughter was safe. The bus schedule said 12 minutes. Rebecca's phone said the next bus was running 18 minutes late. She shifted her weight, trying to stay warm, trying not to think about how tired she was, how her feet hurt, how she still had to pick up Lily and carry her sleeping weight up 2 flights of stairs. Headlights cut through the darkness. A car slowed, pulling to the curb a dark sedan, understated but expensive in the way that whispered money rather than shouting it. The window rolled down. Minsu sat in the driver's seat, and even in the dim streetlight, Rebecca could see he looked exhausted. Not the physical tiredness of a long day, but something deeper, more corrosive. The kind of bone-deep weariness she recognized from her own mirror. "You shouldn't be out here alone this late," he said quietly. "I do it 4 times a week," Rebecca replied, pulling her jacket tighter as another gust of wind hit. "Been doing it for 2 years." Something crossed Minsu's face, not pity exactly. More like recognition. The acknowledgement of someone else who understood what it meant to just keep going, to do the hard thing over and over because there was no other option. "Can I drive you home?" Rebecca hesitated. Every voice she'd ever internalized told her to say no. Her mother's warnings about strange men, her ex-husband's accusations that she was too trusting. Every true crime podcast that started with, she accepted a ride from someone she barely knew. But she was tired. The bus was late. And there was something about the way Minsu looked at her. Not at her body, not with calculation, but with the weary solidarity of someone who also knew what it meant to survive on fumes that made her nod. The car was warm. Classical music played softly through the speakers, something piano-heavy and melancholic. The kind of music that felt like it understood sadness without trying to fix it. They drove in comfortable silence for several minutes, the city passing by in streaks of neon and shadow. Then Rebecca noticed his hands on the steering wheel. His knuckles were scraped, still raw, the skin around them inflamed. There was a bruise blooming along his jaw, partially concealed by what looked like makeup but visible now in the passing streetlights. "You're hurt," she said, the nursing assistant in her automatically cataloging injuries recent, within the last 24 hours, the knuckles suggesting impact with something hard. "It's nothing." That's what everyone says right before an infection sets in. She shifted slightly in her seat, turning toward him. "What happened?" Minsu's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, Rebecca thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly, "A disagreement. About business." "What kind of business?" "The complicated kind." The evasion was clear, deliberate. Rebecca recognized it the same tone her father had used when talking about why he needed to borrow money again. The same careful vagueness her Uncle Terry had employed when explaining why he couldn't make it to Christmas. She'd grown up in a family where certain truths stayed buried because excavating them would collapse everything. So instead of pushing, she asked a different question. "When's the last time someone looked at those cuts properly?" Minsu glanced at her, surprised. "They're fine." "They're not. They're going to scar if you don't treat them right. Get infected if you're unlucky." She paused, aware of what she was about to offer, the vulnerability of it. "I have a first aid kit at my apartment. It's not far. I could—" She stopped, suddenly self-conscious. "I mean, if you want." Minsu pulled to the curb in front of her building without hesitation, as if he'd been waiting for permission to accept help he could never ask for. Upstairs, Lily was still at Rose's. The apartment felt different with just the 2 of them, smaller, more exposed. Rebecca retrieved the first aid kit from the bathroom, while Minsu stood awkwardly in the kitchen. This man who'd been so composed at the market, now uncertain of where to put his hands, how to hold himself in this intimate space. "Sit," Rebecca said gently, pulling out a chair. She worked with the clinical efficiency she'd learned from years of CNA training, cleaning the abraded knuckles with steady hands, her touch careful but not tentative. Minsu sat perfectly still, watching her face as she worked, noting the concentration in her eyes, the small furrow between her brows when she found a deeper cut than she'd expected. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "I do it for a living, just usually with people in their 80s, not their 30s. She dabbed antibiotic ointment on the worst of the scrapes. "I mean, you're good at taking care of people." Rebecca's hands stilled for just a moment. "It's what I know how to do." "Do people take care of you?" The question landed in the small kitchen like something fragile and dangerous. Rebecca resumed working, wrapping gauze around his knuckles with practiced movements. But Minsu saw the answer in the tightness around her mouth, in the way she didn't respond immediately. "They should," he said, so softly it was almost to himself. Rebecca finished bandaging his hand, but neither of them moved. The kitchen light hummed overhead. Outside, rain began its familiar rhythm against the windows. And in the small space between them, something shifted, not romantic, not yet, but a recognition of two people who'd been holding themselves upright for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to lean. "What kind of complicated business are you in, Minsu?" Rebecca asked finally, not looking up from his bandaged hand still resting in her palm. Minsu looked at her, this woman who'd given him her last $20, who'd brought him into her home, who'd fed him and asked for nothing, who was touching him now with more genuine care than anyone had shown him in a decade, and felt the performance crack further. "The kind I'm trying to leave," he said. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was more truth than he'd spoken aloud in years. The envelope arrived at the dental office on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by courier during Rebecca's lunch break. It was addressed in careful handwriting, precise, elegant strokes that suggested someone who'd learned English script as a second language and mastered it through discipline rather than instinct. Rebecca opened it in the break room, alone except for the humming refrigerator and the coffee maker that had been broken for 3 weeks. Inside was a cashier's check and a note card, cream-colored, expensive. Her hands began to tremble as she read the number on the check. $2,000. $2,000 made out to Rebecca Brown, dated that morning, real and impossible in equal measure. The note was shorter, written in that same careful hand. "For the $20, with interest and gratitude. MS." Rebecca sat down heavily in the plastic break room chair, the check still clutched in her shaking fingers. $2,000. She could pay rent 3 months ahead. Buy Lily winter clothes that actually fit. Get her car's check engine light looked at. Replace the space heater that had died last winter. Stop calculating every purchase down to the penny for just a moment, just long enough to breathe. But it was too much. Wildly, impossibly too much. She pulled out her phone, found Minsu's number, the one from the business card he'd left on her counter 6 weeks ago, the one she'd saved but never used. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Then she pressed it. He answered on the second ring. "Rebecca." The way he said her name, like he'd been expecting her call, like he'd been waiting for it, made her breath catch. "This is too much," she said without preamble, her voice tight. "The check. It's too much." "It's exactly right," Minsu replied, his tone calm, measured. $20 was everything you had. 2,000 is a fraction of what I have. The proportions are correct. Rebecca felt something shift in her chest, the mathematics of what he was really saying. He hadn't just remembered the $20. He'd understood what it meant. That it wasn't just $20, but 3 days of groceries, but Lily's lunch money, but the buffer between managing and catastrophe. He'd been watching, seeing her in ways no one else had bothered to see. "That's not how this works," she managed. "You can't just people don't. Have dinner with me." The words were quiet but firm. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" There was a pause, and Rebecca heard something in the silence. A weight, a hesitation, the sound of someone choosing words carefully because they mattered. "Why someone like me needed someone like you to remember I'm human." Rebecca stood in the break room, the check still in her hand, the fluorescent lights harsh overhead, and felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't about repaying a debt. This was about something she didn't have words for yet, about being witnessed, about mattering, about the dangerous gift of being seen. "Okay," she said softly. "Dinner." She could almost hear Minsu's relief through the phone. "Tomorrow night. I'll send a car." "I can meet you," Rebecca interrupted. The thought of a car arriving at her building, of neighbors seeing, of questions she couldn't answer, made her instinctively retreat. Okay. He gave her an address, a restaurant in the International District. 7 o'clock? 7 o'clock, she agreed. After they hung up, Rebecca sat alone in the break room for a long time, holding $2,000 and a truth she couldn't yet name. That kindness wasn't supposed to come with this kind of interest. That being seen wasn't supposed to feel this dangerous. That accepting this check meant crossing a line she couldn't uncross, stepping into a relationship that was no longer simple, no longer just about a stranger who'd needed help in the rain. What Rebecca couldn't know, sitting in that fluorescent-lit break room with her lunch untouched and her hands still shaking, was that Min-soo had been asking himself the same question for 6 weeks. How do you repay someone who gave you everything when she had nothing? How do you quantify the value of being seen as human when you'd forgotten that version of yourself existed? He'd tried to calculate it like he calculated everything else in numbers, in transactions, in the cold mathematics of debt and obligation. $20 became $2,000 because that was the proportion, because that made sense on paper. But the real answer, the one he was finally ready to admit, wasn't about money at all. It was about the morning he'd woken up on her couch to find a 7-year-old drawing in purple crayon, unafraid. About the way Rebecca had set a table with almost nothing and made sure everyone was fed. About how she'd cleaned his wounds without asking what kind of man comes home with scraped knuckles and concealed bruises. About how she'd made him feel, for the first time in 20 years, like he was worth taking care of. The answer was about jeong, that untranslatable Korean word his grandmother had taught him. The bond that forms when someone sees you completely, sees your worst and your weakness and your wounds, and chooses to stay anyway, chooses to feed you breakfast, chooses to bandage your hands, chooses to believe you're worth the last $20 they have. His grandmother used to say that jeong was the most valuable thing you could build with another person, that it was stronger than love, deeper than friendship, more binding than any contract. And Min-soo had been building jeong with Rebecca Brown since the moment she stopped walking when 17 other people hadn't. He just hadn't known what to call it until now. Tomorrow, at dinner, he would try to explain. He would tell her about his grandmother, about the concept of caring for people not because you owed them but because their humanity called to yours. He would try to make her understand that the $2,000 wasn't a transaction, it was a translation, his inadequate attempt to speak a language she'd been fluent in all along. The language of seeing people, of choosing to stay, of believing that kindness without expectation was the rarest, most valuable thing in the world. And the truth was, regardless of what happened next, regardless of the danger that was already circling closer, the organization that was already noticing his distraction, the impossible situation he was about to pull her into, Min-soo knew one thing with absolute certainty. Meeting Rebecca Brown had changed everything. And he wouldn't take it back, even if he could. The Korean barbecue restaurant in Seattle's International District wasn't fancy. No pristine white tablecloths or sommeliers or waiters in pressed uniforms. Just worn wooden tables, the smell of sesame oil and charcoal smoke, and walls decorated with faded photographs of Seoul from decades past. But when the owner saw Min-soo enter, his whole face transformed, greeting him in rapid Korean, clasping his hand with both of hers, leading them past the main dining room to a private space in the back. Rebecca followed, hyper-aware of her Target jeans and the clearance rack blouse she'd chosen because it was the nicest thing she owned. Hyper-aware of the chasm between her world and whatever world Min-soo inhabited, where restaurant owners greeted him like family and private rooms appeared without asking. The room was small, intimate, a low table, cushions on the floor, a built-in grill already warming in the center. Min-soo gestured for her to sit, and she did, awkwardly folding her legs, watching as he moved with practiced ease into the cross-legged position that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times. Then the food began arriving. Small plate spanchen. Min-soo called them, covering every inch of the table. Kimchi, pickled vegetables, seasoned spinach, fish cakes, marinated tofu. Then meat for the grill, beautifully marbled. Steaming bowls of soup. More food than 2 people could possibly eat, presented with the care of a gift rather than a transaction. My grandmother used to say you could judge a person's heart by how they set a table, Min-soo said, watching Rebecca's eyes widen at the abundance. He reached for the tongs, began arranging meat on the grill with practiced movements. If they gave you the best pieces and took the smallest for themselves, if they made sure everyone's bowl was full before they served themselves, you knew they had jeong. What's that? Rebecca asked softly. Minsu was quiet for a moment, turning meat on the grill, choosing his words with the care of someone translating concepts that didn't quite fit into English. There's no direct translation. It's affection that comes from shared experience, emotional intimacy, the bond that forms when someone sees you completely and chooses to stay anyway. He paused, his dark eyes finding hers across the table. You have Jong, Rebecca. I saw it that first morning, the way you fed your daughter first, me second, yourself last, the way you gave without expecting anything back. Rebecca looked down at her hands, uncomfortable with being seen so clearly. That's just being a mother. No, Minsu said quietly, firmly. That's who you are. Being a mother is part of it, but Jung that comes from your soul, not your circumstances. He placed the first pieces of cooked meat on her plate, the best cuts, the most tender pieces before serving himself. And Rebecca recognized the choreography, the same one she'd performed in her own kitchen with scrambled eggs and the last of the orange juice. The grammar of care that transcended language. My mother died when I was young, Minsu continued, his voice steady but carrying weight. My father worked in warehouses after we came to Seattle. Worked himself to exhaustion trying to build something for us. He died in a forklift accident when I was 11. They said it was operator error, but... He stopped, turned meat that didn't need turning. The men who came to the funeral, they called themselves Hyung, older brother. They said they would take care of me, that my father had friends who wouldn't let his son go hungry. Rebecca listened, not touching her food, understanding she was hearing something true and costly. They did take care of me, Minsu said, paid for school, made sure I had clothes, food, a place to live. But nothing was free. Everything was a loan, collecting interest. And the work they gave me to repay them, it wasn't the kind that builds a legitimate life. By the time I was 25, I was too valuable to let go. They'd invested too much, taught me too much, trusted me with too much. The trap was already closed. What kind of work? Rebecca asked gently. The kind that taught me care was transactional, Minsu replied, meeting her eyes. The kind that made me forget people could give without expecting something back. That's why that night, the night you found me, I'd counted 17 people. 17 chances for someone to prove I was wrong about humanity. That somewhere, kindness still existed without calculation. Why were you there? Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper. Why were you like that? Minsu set down the tongs, his hand still for the first time since the food had arrived. I run an import business. Legitimate, legal, profitable. But it started with money from people who don't care about legitimacy. And those people, they still think they own me. They still ask for favors, for access, for proof of loyalty. And when you say no enough times, they remind you what happens to people who forget where they came from. He looked up at her then, and Rebecca saw something in his eyes. She recognized from her own mirror the exhaustion of someone trying to escape a past that had teeth, that wouldn't let go. That night, I'd had a conversation with someone I once trusted. Someone who made it very clear that leaving isn't an option they're willing to accept. I don't usually drink, but that night I wanted to forget who I was for a few hours. His voice dropped lower. And then you appeared. You gave me your last $20 and didn't even ask my name. You brought me into your home, let your daughter near me, fed me like I mattered. Like I was just a person who needed help, not a... He stopped. Couldn't finish. Rebecca reached across the table before she'd fully decided to do it, her hand covering his. Minsu looked down at their joined hands, her fingers work rough and calloused, his scarred across the knuckles, and felt something break open in his chest. I'm not a good man, Rebecca. I've done things you wouldn't forgive if you knew. I've done things I haven't forgiven myself for, Rebecca replied quietly. I stayed in a marriage that made me disappear. I let my daughter watch me become invisible. I accepted being treated like I didn't matter, because I believed I didn't. So I'm not interested in good or bad. I'm interested in truth. Minsu turned his hand over, threading his fingers through hers, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world. The truth is I'm trying to leave a life that doesn't let people leave. The truth is being near me might put you in danger. The truth is, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since that morning in your kitchen when you fed me like I mattered. He paused. his thumb moving across her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it made her throat tight. The truth is, you made me want to be someone who deserves Jong. The food cooled on their plates, forgotten. The private room held them in its small, safe space while outside, Seattle continued its rain-soaked rhythm. And two people who'd spent their lives performing, one as invisible caretaker, one as valuable asset, finally let themselves be seen. The knock on Rebecca's apartment door came at 10 a.m., on a Thursday, 3 days after the dinner that had changed everything. Lily was at school, second grade, Mrs. Patterson's class, safe in a building with locked doors and crossing guards. That detail would matter more than Rebecca could know. She'd been folding laundry, her mind still half in the memory of Min-Soo's hand holding hers, when the knock came. Firm, professional, not the rhythm of a neighbor or delivery person. Something in that knock made her heart rate pick up before she'd even looked through the peephole. Two men stood in the hallway. Expensive suits, the kind that draped perfectly, that cost what Rebecca made in a month. They were polite, unsettlingly so. The shorter one smiled when she opened the door, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. Miss Brown? Rebecca Brown? His English was perfect, barely accented. We're sorry to disturb you. We're looking for Min-Soo Kang. We understand you know him. Every instinct Rebecca had learned from a childhood of reading danger in the tightness of her father's jaw, in the careful way her mother spoke when bill collectors called, flared to life. I barely know him, she said, her hand tight on the doorframe, her body blocking the entrance to her apartment. He's just someone I helped once. Yes, the taller man said, his smile matching his companion's pleasant, empty wrong. We know about your kindness. He gave you money. He speaks of you. This is unusual for him. He doesn't usually speak of people. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Rebecca had become notable by being noticed. By mattering to Min-Soo in a way that made other people pay attention. We're not here to threaten you, the shorter man continued, his tone remaining courteous, conversational. We're here to deliver a message. Min-Soo is important to our organization. His business is important. His loyalty is important. We want to make sure he remembers these facts. Tell him yourself, Rebecca said, her voice steadier than she felt. We will, but sometimes people need reminders of what they value, what could be lost. The man's gaze moved past her into the small apartment, cataloging details with practiced efficiency, the child's drawings on the refrigerator, the school calendar with stars marking Lily's good days, the pink backpack hanging by the door. You have a daughter, yes? 7 years old? She goes to Maple Elementary? Rebecca felt her blood turn to ice. Leave her out of this. Of course, the man said, his tone still pleasant, still wrong. We would never wish harm to a child. We're simply noting, as Min-Soo himself would note, that care is complicated. That the people we choose to care about become considerations, factors in the decisions we make. They left after that, disappearing down the hallway as politely as they'd appeared, and Rebecca stood in her doorway, shaking, understanding with horrible clarity what Min-Soo had tried to warn her about. Being near him might put you in danger. She'd heard the words. She hadn't understood them. Not really. Not until two men in expensive suits knew her daughter's name in school. She called Min-Soo immediately, her fingers fumbling with her phone. They came here, she said when he answered. No greeting, no preamble. Two men. They mentioned Lily. They knew her school. The silence on the other end was profound and terrible. When Min-Soo finally spoke, his voice was flat, controlled in a way that made Rebecca understand she was hearing someone dangerous not to her, but to whoever had sent those men to her door. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. I'll be there in 10 minutes. He arrived in 8. Min-Soo stood in her living room, still in the expensive suit he'd worn to whatever meeting he'd left. But now there was something different about him. The careful businessman was gone. In his place was someone who moved with dangerous precision, who checked her windows, who positioned himself between her and the door without seeming to think about it. I'm sorry, he said, looking at her with something like anguish. I should never have gotten close to you. I knew better. I knew what they'd do. Who are they? Rebecca demanded, her voice sharp with fear and anger and the fierce protectiveness of a mother whose child has been threatened. People I've been trying to break free from for 2 years. People who don't accept that someone can just leave. They think I'm valuable, and valuable things don't get to choose their own freedom. Min-soo crossed to the window, looked out at the street below with the watchful attention of someone who'd learned to map exits, to calculate threats. And now they know that you matter to me, which means they'll use you to ensure compliance. So what do we do? Min-soo turned to look at her, and Rebecca saw the war in his expression, the part of him that wanted to protect her by disappearing, and the part that couldn't bear the thought of losing what she represented. There's no we here, Rebecca. This is my problem. My past. You and Lily, you're not part of this. They made me part of this when they showed up at my door. Rebecca stood, moved closer to him, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the careful control in his posture that was costing him everything to maintain. You said you wanted to be someone who deserves Jung, but that works both ways. I'm not some fragile thing you need to protect by pushing away. I'm someone who sees you and chooses to stay. That's what Jung means, right? Choosing to stay anyway? Min-soo looked at her, this woman who'd given everything for a stranger, who stood in her small apartment facing danger she shouldn't have to face, who was offering him something he'd never had. Partnership instead of obligation, presence instead of transaction. If you stay, he said quietly, each word measured, weighted with consequence. You need to know everything. You need to know exactly who I am and what I've done. Because I won't lie to you, Rebecca. Not about this. Not when your daughter's safety is at stake. Rebecca met his eyes, saw the fear there, the guilt, the desperate hope that she wouldn't walk away now that she understood the cost of being close to him. Then tell me, she said. Tell me the truth. And in the fading morning light of her small apartment, with the threat still lingering in the hallway outside and the weight of impossible choices settling on both their shoulders, Min-soo began to speak. I was 11 when we arrived in Seattle. My father and me running from debt collectors in Busan who would have taken more than money. He worked in warehouses, double shifts, trying to build something for us. He died in a forklift accident when I was 11. They called it operator error, but Min-soo's hands tightened on his knees. The men who came to his funeral, they called themselves Hyung, older brothers. Director Hwang especially. He said my father had been his friend, that he wouldn't let his friend's son go hungry. Rebecca listened, sitting across from him in the mismatched armchair, saying nothing, letting him find his way through the story. The protection came with prices that compounded like interest. They paid for my school, but I worked in their warehouses. They gave me clothes, but I ran errands they couldn't be seen doing. By the time I was 18, I understood the trap. I was too valuable to kill, too useful to release. I knew their business, their contacts, their methods. I'd become exactly what they needed, someone educated enough to appear legitimate, loyal enough to be trusted, desperate enough to never ask questions. He paused, looking at his hands, the same hands that had counted 17 people walking past, that Rebecca had bandaged in this same kitchen weeks ago. The specifics? His voice dropped lower. Money laundering through my import business. Relationships with officials who look the other way. I've witnessed violence. He stopped, forced himself to continue. I've authorized it. When someone threatened operations, threatened people under Hwang's protection. I made calls that resulted in people getting hurt. Rebecca's face remained still, but Min-soo saw her processing, calculating what kind of man sat in her living room. 2 years ago, there was a young man, 23, reminded me of myself at that age. He wanted out, wanted to go to college, have a normal life. He came to me, asked for help. I tried to negotiate his release, offered to pay back what he owed. But the organization doesn't work that way. They made an example of him. Min-soo's voice cracked slightly. I watched them kill someone for wanting what I want, and I realized I was complicit in building this cage. Not just mine, everyone's. That's when I started my plan, he continued. Slowly legitimizing operations, paying back what I owed, dollar by dollar, creating distance, becoming less useful, less entangled. But they don't accept retirement, Rebecca said quietly. No, they see legitimacy as cover, not exit. And recently, they've been testing my loyalty, pushing me to expand, to run new operations, importing more than goods. Things I've refused to touch. He looked up at her. The men who came here? They work for Director Hwang, the elder who adopted me, who gave me everything, who also took everything. What does he want from you? Minsu's jaw tightened. He wants me to run an operation bringing people across borders, workers who'll be trapped the same way I was. And if I refuse, he'll hurt the people I care about until I comply. He paused. He knows about you now, about Lily. That makes you leverage. Rebecca was silent for a long moment, her mind working through scenarios, calculating risks the way she calculated grocery budgets. What could she afford to lose? What was non-negotiable? I need to think about Lily, she said finally. I need to think about what's right for her. You should, Minsu replied immediately. You should take her and disappear. I can give you money, set up protection, make sure. That's not what I said. Rebecca's voice was firm. I said I need to think. I didn't say I was leaving. Minsu looked at her, confusion and hope warring in his expression. Running doesn't solve the problem, Rebecca continued, leaning forward. They know about us now. They know where I live, where Lily goes to school. Disappearing just makes us easier targets, because you won't be there. She paused. What if we don't run? What if we find another way? There is no other way. Minsu's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd examined every angle, every possibility. You don't understand how this works. The Jopak, it's not just business. It's family. It's Yoon debt that goes back generations. You don't walk away from family. You don't betray the people who raised you, fed you, kept you alive. Then explain it to me, Rebecca said, her voice steady but carrying steel underneath. Because I've spent my whole life accepting that there's no way out. No way out of poverty. No way out of bad marriages. No way out of being invisible. I've spent 32 years accepting what other people told me was impossible. And I'm tired of it. She stood, moved closer to him, and Minsu saw in her face the same determination he'd seen that night in the rain, the refusal to walk past someone who needed help, even when it was impractical, even when it was dangerous. You said Huang sees you as valuable, Rebecca continued. What makes you valuable? I'm educated, American. I understand both worlds, Korean and American, legitimate and shadow. I can move between them without raising suspicion. So you're valuable because you're rare. Because most people in his organization can't do what you do. Yes. Then the question isn't how to become less valuable. Rebecca said slowly, thinking through it the way she'd learned to problem solve on night shifts when patients coded and doctors weren't immediately available. The question is how to make your value work for you instead of against you. How to become so valuable that losing you costs him more than letting you go. Minsu stared at her, something shifting in his expression, the first flicker of possibility where, before there'd only been resignation. You don't understand what you're suggesting. No, Rebecca agreed. I don't. But you do. And we're going to figure it out together. Minsu looked at this woman who'd just heard the worst of him, who knew he'd authorized violence and laundered money, and been complicit in trapping others the way he'd been trapped, and she was still here. Still choosing to stay. Still believing that impossible didn't mean unchangeable. Why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you risk everything for this? For me? Rebecca reached out, took his hand the way she had at dinner, her work-rough fingers threading through his. Because you made me feel seen for the first time in my life. Because Jung isn't just about staying when things are easy, it's about staying when they're hard. She paused. And because I think we're both tired of being trapped. Director Huang's office overlooked Elliott Bay, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing Seattle's waterfront in all its gray, rain-soaked beauty. The view was deliberate, a reminder to anyone who entered of how much he owned, how far his reach extended across this city that had once been foreign and was now his domain. Minsu stood before the man who'd raised him, the man who'd given him everything and taken everything in equal measure, and knew this conversation would determine whether Rebecca and Lily had a future. Whether he had a future. It had been a week since the men had visited Rebecca's apartment. A week of silence, of Minsu not returning calls, not appearing at meetings. A week that Huang had allowed because he understood that sometimes lessons needed time to settle, that sometimes the best pressure was the anticipation of consequences rather than consequences themselves. Minsu ya, Huang said, using the affectionate diminutive reserved for family, for sons. His Korean was formal, tinged with the Busan accent they both carried. Sit. We need to talk. Minsu remained standing. A small rebellion, but one Huang noted with the raise of an eyebrow. I raised you better than this. Huang continued, switching to English, a reminder that he'd adapted, that he'd learned this country's language and customs while never forgetting where he came from. You don't refuse family. You don't ignore calls from your elders. You don't let distractions compromise your judgment. She's not a distraction, Minsu said quietly. No? Huang leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled. Then what is she? This woman you've given money to, spent time with, spoken of in ways that make my people nervous. What is she to you? Minsu chose his words carefully, knowing everything depended on the next few minutes. She reminded me why we came here. Why my father worked himself to death. Why you built what you built. We came to America for a future, Abioji. For our people to have opportunities. But somewhere along the way, we forgot that future isn't just about profit. It's about building something that lasts. Something clean. Huang's expression didn't change, but Minsu saw the flicker of interest. The old man valued tradition, valued the idea of legacy. The operation you want me to run, Minsu continued. I'll do it, but through my legitimate business, with conditions, proper documentation, legal channels where possible. It takes longer, yes, but it protects us, makes us untouchable in ways violence never could. You want to go slower when I'm telling you to move faster? I want to go smarter. The world is changing, Abioji. The old ways they work until they don't. Until one ambitious prosecutor decides to make a name for themselves. Until... Huang's phone rang, the sound cutting through the tension. He glanced at it, frowned, answered in rapid Korean. Minsu watched his face change, the careful control giving way to something harder, more dangerous. When Huang hung up, his eyes were cold. It seems our rivals have been busy. They've approached 3 of our business partners, suggesting our organization is weakening. That our people are more interested in American women than protecting our territory. Minsu felt his stomach drop. This was worse than he'd imagined. Personal complications becoming organizational vulnerabilities. They're using your distraction as proof, Huang said. Testing boundaries, threatening territory we've held for 15 years. Then let me fix it, Minsu said immediately. Give me 6 months. I'll secure the territory, reinforce relationships, show strength. But after, we talk about my exit. Real exit, Abioji. Not retirement, not distance. Freedom. Huang was silent for a long moment, weighing, calculating. And the woman? She stays protected, untouched. That's non-negotiable. You'd negotiate with me? With family? I'm asking, Abioji, as your son, as someone who's given you 20 years. I'm asking for this one thing. Rebecca was restocking supplies at the nursing home when her phone rang. Lily's school. Her heart immediately kicked into a different rhythm, the primal fear of every parent receiving an unexpected call. Miss Brown? This is Principal Morrison. Everything's fine, but someone came by asking about Lily today. Said they were a family friend. Wanted to confirm her schedule. Our secretary followed protocol. Didn't give information, but I thought you should know. Rebecca's hands went cold. What did they look like? Asian gentleman, well-dressed. Very polite, but something felt... Rebecca didn't wait for her to finish. She called the number Minsu had given her, not his personal cell, but another number, for emergencies. A man answered on the first ring, his English minimal but his understanding immediate. Lily, Maple Elementary. Now, Rebecca said, her voice sharp with controlled panic. Minsu said he said you'd help. On my way. 5 minutes. Minsu's phone buzzed. A text from the man he'd assigned to watch over Rebecca. The protection he'd arranged without telling her because he'd known this might happen. School situation. Handled. Everyone's safe. He showed the phone to Huang. This is why I need them protected. Not threatened, not used, protected. I'll give you 6 months, a year, whatever it takes to secure territory. But they stay safe. Huang studied him for a long moment, seeing something in Minsu's face that made him nod slowly. 1 year. You help me defend against this challenge, show our organization is still strong, and then we discuss your transition. But Minsuya, if you fail, if this woman makes you weak instead of strong, the debt comes due. All of it. Do you understand? I understand. Minsu arrived after dark, exhaustion written in every line of his body. Rebecca had already picked up Lily, already gotten her fed and into bed, already spent hours imagining worst-case scenarios and forcing herself to stay calm. "I bought us time," Minsu said quietly, standing in her small kitchen that smelled like lavender and felt like the only safe place in the world. "But I had to make promises that take me backward. Deeper into the organization, not away from it." "How long?" Rebecca asked, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. 6 months, maybe a year. There's a territorial challenge, rivals testing boundaries. I have to help Huang secure it, prove I'm still loyal, still valuable." He paused, looked at her with something like anguish. "You can still leave. Take Lily somewhere safe, somewhere I can't touch you, where they can't use you against me." Rebecca moved closer, placed her hand over his heart, felt it beating too fast. "I gave you $20 when I had nothing. I'm not abandoning you now that things are hard." "Rebecca, we do this together," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes. You protect us, we protect you. That's how Zhang works, right? Partnership, not rescue." Something broke in Minsu then the last wall, the final performance. He pulled her close, buried his face in her hair, and let himself shake with the relief of not being alone, of having someone choose to stay when leaving would be smarter, safer, easier. When he kissed her, it was tender and desperate and full of fear and hope in equal measure, a kiss earned through months of slow building, through emotional intimacy rather than physical attraction, through seeing each other's worst and choosing to stay anyway. "Mom?" Lily's sleepy voice came from the bedroom doorway. "Is Minsu staying for breakfast?" They broke apart, and Minsu looked at this 7-year-old in her unicorn pajamas, asking the question that contained multitudes. "Yes," Rebecca said softly, looking at Minsu, making the choice that would change all their lives. "He's staying." Minsu looked at Rebecca in the dim light of her kitchen, this woman who'd seen his worst and chosen to stay, and realized something terrifying: he'd spent 20 years building walls to stay alive, and she'd dismantled them with simple kindness. Now he had something more dangerous than enemies. He had something to lose. Rebecca had given her last $20 to a stranger in the rain, expecting nothing in return. What she received instead was a man trying to find his way out of darkness, a daughter who finally felt safe around a father figure, and a love that was more terrifying than any threat because it was real. Minsu had spent 20 years believing freedom meant being alone. Rebecca was teaching him that freedom meant being seen. And in Seattle's International District, where generations of immigrants had built lives from nothing, 2 people who'd made themselves invisible were learning to be witnessed. The journey from $20 to forever was just beginning, and it would cost them everything they had.